The Martinez family had always appeared picture, perfect from the outside, living in their modest two-story home on Maple Street, where neighbors knew them as the friendly family with 3 children who always waved hello. Maria Martinez, now 17 years old, had spent her entire childhood believing that Robert Martinez was her father, the man who had raised her alongside her 2 younger siblings, 13-year-old Carlos and 10-year-old Sofia. The family celebrated birthdays together, attended church every Sunday, and maintained traditions that seemed unbreakable, creating memories that filled photo albums lining their living room shelves. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, tensions had been building for years, small cracks in the foundation that everyone pretended not to notice. Maria had always felt slightly different from her siblings, not just in appearance, but in the way her mother, Teresa, sometimes looked at her with a mixture of love and something else she couldn't quite identify, perhaps guilt or sadness. The whispers between her parents late at night, the conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms, and the occasional heated arguments behind closed bedroom doors all contributed to an atmosphere of unspoken secrets. Family gatherings with extended relatives sometimes brought uncomfortable moments when an aunt would make a comment about Maria's features not matching anyone in the family, quickly followed by nervous laughter and subject changes. These moments planted seeds of doubt in Maria's mind, though she pushed them away, unwilling to question the only reality she had ever known. Her relationship with Robert had always been warm but somehow distant, lacking the easy affection she observed between him and Carlos and Sofia, though she attributed this to being the eldest and naturally more independent. Teresa worked long hours as a nurse at the county hospital, often coming home exhausted and emotionally drained from dealing with patients and their families, while Robert managed a small auto repair shop that barely provided enough income to keep the family afloat. Money was perpetually tight. Arguments about finances were common, and the stress of making ends meet created an environment where bigger questions about family dynamics remained buried under the immediate concerns of survival. Maria excelled in school, maintaining straight A's and participating in debate team, perhaps unconsciously trying to prove her worth and belong more fully to the family unit. She had dreams of attending college, becoming a lawyer, and making her parents proud, goals that drove her to stay focused despite the nagging feeling that something fundamental about her identity remained hidden. Everything changed on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in late July, when the entire extended family gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration of Teresa's mother's 75th birthday at the local community center. The hall was decorated with balloons and streamers, tables laden with homemade dishes that represented their family's Puerto Rican heritage, and multiple generations of relatives filled the space with laughter and animated Spanish conversations. Maria helped her mother set up the dessert table, while Carlos and Sofia ran around with their younger cousins, their shrieks of joy echoing off the walls. Robert stood with his brothers near the barbecue grills outside, discussing sports and politics while keeping an eye on the cooking meat. Teresa's sister, Aunt Carmen, had always been the outspoken member of the family, known for speaking her mind regardless of consequences, and she had been drinking steadily since arriving at the party. As the afternoon wore on and the alcohol continued flowing, Carmen's voice grew louder and her comments more pointed, directed increasingly toward Teresa with barbs that seemed to reference old conflicts and resentments. Maria noticed her mother growing tense, her smile becoming forced, her responses to Carmen shorter and sharper. The atmosphere shifted subtly as other family members began to sense the building confrontation, conversations quieting as attention drifted toward the two sisters. Carmen made a comment about Teresa always thinking she was better than everyone else, always pretending to be so perfect when she had her own secrets to hide. Teresa warned her sister to stop, to not ruin their mother's birthday with old grievances, but Carmen was beyond the point of restraint. She mentioned something about lies and deception, about children who didn't know the truth about where they came from, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Maria felt her stomach drop as she realized the conversation was somehow about her family, about secrets that were about to be exposed in the worst possible way. Teresa stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and demanded that Carmen keep her mouth shut. But her sister was unleashed now, years of resentment and judgment pouring out. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, Carmen announced that Maria deserved to know the truth, that Robert wasn't her real father, that Teresa had been involved with another man before her marriage, and had passed off the resulting pregnancy as Robert's child. The words hung in the air like physical objects, heavy and destructive, as every person in the room froze in shock. The immediate aftermath of Carmen's revelation was chaos incarnate, with multiple family members speaking at once, some trying to hush Carmen while others demanded explanations from Teresa, creating a cacophony of voices that overwhelmed Maria's ability to process what she had just heard. She stood paralyzed by the dessert table, a serving spoon still in her hand, her mind refusing to accept the words that had just shattered her understanding of her own identity. Teresa's face had drained of color, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at her daughter with an expression of absolute devastation, reaching toward Maria with trembling hands as if to undo what had been said through sheer physical connection. Robert stormed in from outside where someone had rushed to inform him of what transpired, his face contorted with rage directed at both Carmen and Teresa, shouting about betrayal and lies while his brothers tried to restrain him. Carlos and Sofia clung to each other near the children's table, confused and frightened by the adult chaos erupting around them, too young to fully comprehend what was happening, but old enough to understand that their family was fracturing before their eyes. Maria's grandmother sat in her chair of honor, silently weeping as her birthday celebration disintegrated into the exposure of family secrets she had apparently known about for years. Other relatives began gathering their belongings, ushering children toward exits, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene, while simultaneously ensuring they wouldn't miss any details they could later discuss among themselves. Maria finally found her voice and screamed for everyone to stop, the sound cutting through the noise with its raw pain and demanding attention. She looked directly at her mother and asked if it was true, if Robert was not her biological father, if her entire life had been built on a lie. Teresa could barely speak through her sobbing, but managed to nod, confirming the truth that Maria had never wanted to know. The world seemed to tilt beneath Maria's feet as 17 years of certainty evaporated in an instant, replaced by questions about who she really was and where she truly came from. She dropped the serving spoon, which clattered against the table, and ran from the community center into the parking lot, ignoring her mother's desperate calls for her to wait, to let her explain. The summer heat hit her like a physical force as she stumbled between parked cars, her breath coming in gasps that felt like suffocation, her mind spiraling with implications and anger and confusion. Maria walked for hours that evening through her neighborhood streets as the sun set and darkness crept across suburban landscapes, her phone buzzing constantly with calls and messages from her mother that she refused to answer. Every memory from her childhood now appeared in a different light, reinterpreted through the lens of this new terrible knowledge that explained so many small moments she had dismissed or rationalized. The times Robert had seemed distant weren't just her imagination or teenage interpretation. He had known she wasn't biologically his, had been raising another man's child while pretending otherwise. Her mother's occasional sad looks weren't just maternal worry, but guilt over the deception maintained for nearly 18 years. The comments from relatives that had always seemed slightly off target now made perfect sense as references to secrets everyone except the children had been aware of. She thought about her features, her darker hair when everyone else in the immediate family was lighter, her height when both Teresa and Robert were relatively short, the shape of her eyes that didn't quite match either parent. These physical differences had been explained away with references to distant relatives and genetic variation. But now they pointed to an entirely different biological origin. Maria felt betrayed not just by her mother, but by her entire extended family, who had apparently known the truth and maintained the lie through her entire childhood. She felt angry at Robert for treating her differently while never explaining why, for the subtle distance she had always sensed but couldn't articulate. Most of all, she felt angry at herself for not questioning more directly, for accepting the explanations and pushing down her intuitive sense that something wasn't right. As she walked past houses filled with families eating dinner together, watching television together, existing in their bubbles of assumed truth, Maria wondered how many other children were living with similar secrets, how many families maintained facades that would eventually crumble. She finally sat down on a park bench near the playground where she had spent countless hours as a child, swinging and sliding and believing in the simple reality of her family structure. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was Carlos calling, and something in Maria made her answer, because whatever had happened wasn't his fault or Sophia's, and they would need her in the coming days. Carlos's voice was small and frightened when Maria answered, asking where she was and begging her to come home because everyone was fighting and Sophia wouldn't stop crying and he didn't understand what was happening. Maria's anger softened slightly at hearing her little brother's distress, reminding her that regardless of the revelations about her own paternity, these were still her siblings who needed stability in the midst of family chaos. She promised Carlos she would come home soon and that everything would be okay, even though she had no idea if that was true or even possible. When Maria finally returned to their house around 9 o'clock that evening, she found Robert's truck gone from the driveway and her mother sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by used tissues, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. Teresa looked up when Maria entered, starting to speak, but Maria held up her hand to stop her, saying she needed to check on Carlos and Sophia first before they had any conversation. She found both her younger siblings in Carlos's room, Sophia curled up on her brother's bed while Carlos sat against the wall, both of them looking up at Maria with expressions that mixed relief at her return with anxiety about what would happen next. Maria sat down with them and explained in simple terms that sometimes adults make complicated decisions that children don't understand until they're older, that the family was going through a difficult time, but that she loved them and would always be their sister no matter what. Sophia asked if Maria was going to leave them like their dad did, which revealed that Robert had apparently stormed out after they returned home from the disastrous party. Maria assured them she wasn't going anywhere, that they were stuck with her no matter what happened between the adults, and she would always protect them and be there for them. She stayed with Carlos and Sophia until they fell asleep, Sophia still clutching her favorite stuffed animal, and Carlos trying to appear brave despite his obvious fear. Only after both siblings were sleeping peacefully did Maria return downstairs to confront her mother and demand the full truth about her biological father and why this secret had been maintained for so long. Teresa had composed herself somewhat by this point, though she still looked devastated and exhausted, years older than she had appeared just that morning. She gestured for Maria to sit down at the table, poured them both glasses of water, and began the difficult process of explaining the circumstances of Maria's conception and the decisions that had led to 17 years of deception. Teresa's story emerged haltingly, punctuated by long pauses and renewed tears, beginning with her relationship with a man named David Rodriguez, whom she had dated seriously before meeting Robert. David had been charming and passionate, someone who made Teresa feel alive and special in ways she had never experienced before, but he was also unreliable and noncommittal about their future together. They had been together for nearly 2 years, on and off, breaking up and reconciling multiple times as David struggled with direction in his life, and Teresa tried to imagine building a stable future with someone so unpredictable. During one of their reconciliation periods, Teresa became pregnant with Maria, news that should have brought them closer, but instead seemed to trigger David's deepest fears about responsibility and commitment. He initially promised to step up and be a father, to get his life together and support Teresa and their coming child. But as the weeks progressed, his anxiety became apparent in missed calls, canceled plans, and increasing emotional distance. Teresa watched as the man she loved slowly backed away from the reality of impending parenthood, making excuses and gradually disappearing from her life despite her attempts to make him understand the seriousness of their situation. By the time Teresa was 4 months pregnant, David had essentially vanished, changing his phone number and avoiding places where he might encounter her, leaving her alone and facing single motherhood without support or resources. Teresa was devastated and terrified, knowing her family would be disappointed and judgmental about her situation, worried about her ability to raise a child alone while working and trying to complete her nursing education. It was during this lowest point in her life that Robert entered the picture, a friend of her cousin who had always harbored feelings for Teresa and who approached her with kindness and genuine concern when he learned about her situation. Robert offered something David never had: stability, reliability, and a willingness to commit to Teresa and her unborn child without hesitation or doubt. He proposed marriage after only a few weeks of renewed acquaintance, promising to raise Maria as his own daughter and give Teresa the partnership she needed to build a secure life. Teresa accepted, desperate for the stability Robert offered and believing that David's absence meant he would never return to complicate the situation. They married quickly in a small ceremony attended by immediate family, and Robert legally established paternity for Maria when she was born, his name going on the birth certificate as her father without question or legal challenge. As Teresa continued her explanation, Maria struggled to process the complex emotional landscape her mother was describing, trying to reconcile the desperate young woman in the story with the composed, hard-working mother she had always known. Teresa explained that the plan had been to never tell Maria about David, to allow her to grow up believing Robert was her biological father, and sparing her the pain of knowing she had been essentially abandoned before birth. Most of Teresa's family knew the truth about the timeline and Maria's actual paternity, but they had agreed to maintain the fiction for the child's benefit, believing that a comfortable lie was preferable to a painful truth. Robert had genuinely tried to love Maria as his own daughter. Teresa insisted, but as the years passed and he and Teresa had biological children together, the difference in his feelings became apparent despite his best intentions. Carlos and Sophia's arrivals seemed to highlight for Robert what he felt for his actual biological children versus what he could muster for Maria, creating the emotional distance Maria had always sensed but couldn't explain. Teresa had watched this dynamic develop with growing guilt and concern, knowing that Maria deserved better but trapped by the deception they had initiated 17 years earlier. There had been arguments between Teresa and Robert over the years about his treatment of Maria, fights about whether they should tell her the truth, disagreements about what they owed her versus what they owed Carlos and Sophia. Robert had sometimes expressed resentment about raising another man's child, particularly during financial stress when every dollar mattered and he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of 3 children, including one who wasn't biologically his. These arguments had been the whispered conversations Maria sometimes overheard, the tension she sensed without understanding its source. Teresa had occasionally tried to locate David over the years, searching social media and making discreet inquiries among mutual acquaintances, wondering if he had matured and might want to know his daughter or provide some support. But David had apparently moved out of state years ago, started a new life somewhere else, and seemed to have successfully erased his past, including the daughter he had left behind. Teresa showed Maria a photograph she had kept hidden all these years, a picture of young David smiling at the camera, and Maria stared at it, recognizing her own features reflected in this stranger's face. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile, the way he held his head. This was her biological father. This man who had chosen to disappear rather than face the responsibility of parenthood, leaving behind a daughter who would grow up questioning why she didn't quite fit in her own family. The revelation that she had been abandoned by her biological father before she was even born hit Maria with unexpected force, creating a different type of pain from the betrayal she felt about the deception. She had spent her entire life sensing that something was different about her relationship with Robert, attributing his distance to her own failings or personality defects, trying harder to earn his love and approval without understanding that the obstacle was biology rather than anything she had done wrong. Now she understood that she had been rejected twice, first by David, who had chosen to disappear rather than be her father, and then more subtly by Robert, who had tried but couldn't fully overcome the biological difference between Maria and his own children. The knowledge that everyone in her extended family had known this truth while she remained ignorant felt like a massive conspiracy, making her question every interaction and every relationship she thought she understood. Maria asked her mother why she had never tried harder to make David take responsibility, why she had allowed him to simply walk away without consequences, and Teresa explained through fresh tears that she had been young and scared and powerless, lacking the resources or knowledge to pursue legal remedies. This was before DNA testing was readily available, before social media made people easier to track, before she understood her rights and options as a mother seeking child support. By the time Teresa had gained the confidence and knowledge to potentially pursue David legally, years had passed and she was married to Robert, who was providing for Maria, making the situation legally and emotionally complicated. Part of Teresa had wanted to protect Maria from knowing she had been abandoned, believing that not knowing was better than carrying that rejection throughout childhood. Another part of Teresa had wanted to protect the stability she had built with Robert, not wanting to invite David back into their lives where he might disrupt the family structure or confuse Maria about who her real father was. These decisions that had seemed reasonable or necessary at the time now appeared cowardly and selfish to Maria, prioritizing adult comfort over a child's right to know her own origins. Maria asked about David's family, whether she had grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins on his side who didn't even know she existed. And Teresa admitted she didn't know much about his extended family beyond meeting his parents briefly during their relationship. The realization that she potentially had an entire side of her family tree that was completely unknown was dizzying, raising questions about medical history, genetic heritage, and relationships she had been denied without even knowing they could exist. Over the following days, the Martinez household existed in a state of tense limbo as everyone tried to process the revelations and figure out how to move forward from the shattered pretense of normalcy. Robert returned home after 2 days staying with his brother, but he and Teresa barely spoke to each other beyond necessary logistics about the children, sleeping in separate rooms and moving around each other like wary strangers. Maria avoided both her mother and Robert as much as possible, spending time in her room researching paternity law, DNA testing, and searching online for any information she could find about David Rodriguez. The common nature of the name made searching difficult, requiring her to narrow parameters using approximate age, possible locations, and the few details Teresa had reluctantly provided about his background and interests. Carlos and Sofia walked on eggshells around the house, quieter than usual, hyper-aware of the tension and afraid that one wrong word might trigger another explosion of adult emotion. Teresa tried several times to have deeper conversations with Maria, to explain more about the circumstances and decisions that had led to this situation. But Maria wasn't ready to forgive or understand, her hurt and anger still too fresh and overwhelming. She felt betrayed by both her parents, Teresa for lying to her for 17 years, and Robert for treating her differently while never explaining why, for making her feel like she had to earn love that should have been unconditional. Her feelings about David were more complicated because how could you hate or blame someone you had never known? Someone who was essentially a phantom in your life. Yet Maria did feel abandoned by him, rejected before she was even born, wondering what was wrong with her that her biological father had chosen to disappear rather than know her. The questions about her identity extended beyond just paternity to wondering how much of her personality, talents, and interests came from David versus Teresa. Whether the traits that made her feel different from Carlos and Sofia were genetic inheritances from a father she had never met. Maria looked at the photograph of David repeatedly, studying his features and trying to imagine what he would look like now at 40. Whether she would recognize him if she passed him on the street, whether he ever thought about the daughter he had abandoned. She created social media accounts on multiple platforms and began searching for David Rodriguez systematically, narrowing by age range and location, examining profile pictures for faces that might resemble her own or the young man in Teresa's old photograph. Maria's search for David became increasingly obsessive as she spent hours each night scrolling through profiles and trying to piece together fragments of information that might lead her to her biological father. She joined online forums for people searching for absent parents, learning strategies and resources from others in similar situations, discovering that her experience of discovering late in life that her presumed father wasn't biological was surprisingly common. These forums were filled with stories of deception and discovery, of DNA tests revealing unexpected truths, of people finding biological parents decades after being told they were dead or simply never mentioned. Some stories ended with joyful reunions and rebuilt relationships, but many others described rejection, disappointment, and biological parents who had moved on with their lives and didn't want reminders of past complications. Maria read these stories with a mixture of hope and dread, wondering which narrative would become her own if she successfully located David. She learned about DNA testing services that could potentially help her find biological relatives if David or anyone in his family had submitted their DNA to genealogical databases. And she researched the legal implications of paternity, including whether David could be pursued for back child support despite never having established legal paternity. Part of Maria wanted justice, wanted David to face consequences for his abandonment, while another part simply wanted answers about who he was and why he had made the choices he did. Meanwhile, at school, Maria struggled to maintain her usual academic performance, finding it difficult to concentrate on calculus problems or English essays when her entire understanding of her own identity had been upended. Her best friend, Jessica, noticed the change in Maria's demeanor and eventually persuaded her to explain what had happened, leading to a tearful conversation where Maria finally verbalized all the confusion and pain she was experiencing. Jessica was supportive and understanding, but even she couldn't fully comprehend what it felt like to discover that your entire life narrative was built on a lie, that the person you thought was your father was actually just someone who had agreed to play that role. Maria found herself looking at other people differently now, wondering how many of them might be living with similar secrets, how many families maintained facades that would eventually crack under pressure. She became hyper-aware of parent-child interactions, analyzing whether affection seemed genuine or forced, whether family resemblances were real or assumed, whether the performance of family unity masked deeper disconnections and deceptions. 3 weeks after the birthday party disaster, Maria made a breakthrough in her search when she found a David Rodriguez on LinkedIn, whose profile listed him as working in construction management in Arizona, and whose age matched what her biological father would be now. The profile picture was difficult to see clearly, but something about the set of the jaw and the shape of the eyes resonated with the younger David in Teresa's photograph and with Maria's own features when she looked in the mirror. Her hands shook as she created a LinkedIn profile of her own, trying to decide whether to reach out directly or gather more information first. Terrified of making contact, but unable to stop herself from taking this step toward potential truth. She spent an entire day crafting and recrafting a message before finally sending it, explaining that she was trying to locate a David Rodriguez who had lived in their city approximately 18 years ago and had known Teresa Martinez, asking if this was the right person and if he would be willing to speak with her about an important matter. The message felt simultaneously too vague and too specific, potentially cryptic to someone who wasn't the right David, but possibly transparent enough to make her biological father uncomfortable if this was indeed him. After sending the message, Maria checked her LinkedIn account obsessively, refreshing the page every few minutes to see if David had viewed her profile or responded to her message. Days passed without response, and Maria began to lose hope, wondering if this was the wrong David Rodriguez, or if the right one was deliberately ignoring a message from a past he had tried to forget. Then finally, after 5 agonizing days of waiting, a response appeared in her inbox, brief and cautious, but confirming that yes, he had known Teresa Martinez years ago in their hometown. His message asked why Maria was inquiring about this, what she wanted, and Maria realized with a shock of recognition and dread that she had actually found him, that this was her biological father responding to her message without yet knowing who she was or what she represented from his past. She stared at the message for hours, trying to decide how to respond, whether to reveal her identity directly or continue gathering information indirectly, whether she was emotionally prepared for whatever would come next in this conversation. Finally, after calling Jessica for moral support and spending another hour crafting her response, Maria wrote back explaining that she was Teresa's daughter, conceived during their relationship 18 years ago, and that she had only recently learned that David was her biological father and she wanted to talk with him about his perspective on what had happened. The response from David came more quickly this time, arriving just a few hours after Maria sent her revelation message, and his words conveyed shock, confusion, and immediate denial of responsibility. He claimed he had no idea Teresa had been pregnant when they broke up, that she had never told him about the baby, that he would have done something if he had known, but he couldn't be blamed for a situation he had been kept ignorant about. His message asked whether Maria was certain about her paternity, suggesting that perhaps Teresa had been with other men around the same time and was mistaken about who the biological father actually was, deflecting responsibility with speculation and doubt. Maria felt fury rise in her chest reading these defensive words, this immediate retreat into denial and victim, claiming from the man who had abandoned her mother during pregnancy. She responded with facts Teresa had provided about the timeline, about David's gradual withdrawal when he learned about the pregnancy, about his eventual disappearance and refusal to answer Teresa's calls or take any responsibility. David's next message shifted tactics slightly, acknowledging that he did remember Teresa being pregnant, but claiming he had been young and scared and overwhelmed, that he had made mistakes, but that was nearly 18 years ago, and he had a different life now. He mentioned a wife and 2 children, a stepdaughter from his wife's previous marriage, a life he had built in Arizona far from the complications of his past. His words made clear that Maria represented a threat to this carefully constructed new life, an inconvenient reminder of irresponsibility and abandonment that he had apparently never disclosed to his current family. Maria realized with sinking clarity that David wasn't going to welcome her with open arms, wasn't going to express remorse or interest in building a relationship, was instead going to treat her as a problem to be managed or minimized. She found herself crying angry tears at the injustice of it all, that she hadn't asked to be born, hadn't asked for David to be her biological father, hadn't done anything to deserve this rejection except exist as evidence of his past mistakes. Yet, here she was being treated like the villain of the story, like her mere existence was an imposition on the man who had contributed half her DNA and then disappeared from responsibility. David's subsequent messages became increasingly defensive and hostile as Maria pressed for acknowledgement and accountability. with him eventually suggesting that she should be grateful for Robert raising her since David clearly wasn't father material anyway, and that digging up the past would only hurt everyone involved, including his current children, who didn't need to know about their father's previous failures. The exchanges with David left Maria feeling hollowed out and worthless, confirming her worst fears that her biological father's abandonment had been personal and deliberate rather than circumstantial or unavoidable. She stopped responding to his messages after he suggested they end this conversation and move on with their separate lives, his final message offering a perfunctory apology for any pain caused but firmly stating he wasn't interested in building a relationship or being part of her life going forward. Maria showed the message exchanges to Teresa, who read them with a mixture of sadness and resignation, admitting that David's responses were consistent with the man she had known 18 years ago, someone who prioritized his own comfort and avoided uncomfortable realities. Teresa apologized again for not being honest with Maria from the beginning, acknowledging that perhaps knowing the truth earlier would have allowed Maria to build appropriate expectations rather than being blindsided by both the deception and David's rejection simultaneously. The conversation with Teresa was difficult but necessary, allowing them to begin the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by years of lies, even if those lies had been well-intentioned. Maria expressed her hurt not just about the paternity issue, but about being treated differently by Robert throughout her childhood, about sensing something was wrong, but being gaslit into believing she was imagining things or being too sensitive. Teresa admitted she had failed Maria by not standing up more forcefully to Robert's subtle mistreatment, by prioritizing marital harmony and family stability over her daughter's emotional needs. She explained that she had been caught between loyalty to her husband, who had agreed to raise another man's child, and protection of that child, who deserved better than conditional acceptance, and that she had made countless mistakes trying to balance those competing obligations. Maria asked whether Robert had ever truly cared about her, or whether the entire relationship had been performance and obligation. And Teresa insisted that Robert had tried his best, even if his best fell short of what Maria deserved. The conversation turned to practical matters, including whether they should pursue legal action against David for child support, whether it was worth the emotional and financial cost of forcing accountability on someone who clearly wanted nothing to do with his biological daughter. Teresa left the decision to Maria, promising to support whatever choice she made, while also noting that pursuing David legally might require DNA testing and court appearances, and reliving this trauma repeatedly throughout the legal process. Maria decided against pursuing David legally, concluding that forcing him to pay child support wouldn't change his fundamental rejection of her, and might actually make her feel worse by quantifying her worth in monthly payments from someone who didn't want her. Instead, she chose to focus her energy on processing her feelings and rebuilding relationships within the family she actually had, flawed and complicated as it was. This meant having difficult conversations with Robert, finally addressing openly the distance and differential treatment she had experienced throughout her childhood. Robert struggled to articulate his feelings, admitting that he had tried to love Maria the same as Carlos and Sofia, but found himself unable to overcome the biological difference, especially as financial pressures mounted and resentment built about supporting a child who wasn't his while his own children needed things he couldn't afford. His honesty was painful but valuable, allowing Maria to understand that the problem had never been her inadequacy or failure to earn his love, but rather his own limitations and inability to transcend biology in his parenting. Robert apologized for making Maria feel lesser or different, acknowledging that she had deserved better and that his treatment of her had been unfair regardless of the circumstances of her birth. He expressed willingness to work on their relationship if Maria wanted that, to try to build something authentic rather than continuing the pretense of a father-daughter bond that had never fully existed. Maria appreciated his honesty even as it hurt, and they agreed to approach their relationship differently going forward, acknowledging the reality of their situation rather than forcing roles that didn't fit. With Carlos and Sofia, Maria had separate conversations explaining in age, appropriate terms what had happened and reassuring them that she was still their sister and always would be, that adult complications didn't change the sibling bond they shared. Sofia was too young to fully understand the nuances, but was relieved that Maria wasn't leaving and that the family wasn't completely falling apart. Carlos, at 13, grasped more of the complexity and asked thoughtful questions about what this meant for their family structure, and whether Maria would try to have a relationship with David. Maria explained that David wasn't interested in being part of her life, which hurt but was something she had to accept, and that the family she had grown up with was still her family even if the biological connections were different than she had believed. The remainder of Maria's senior year of high school was a period of gradual healing and adjustment as the family found a new equilibrium based on acknowledged truth rather than maintained fiction. The extended family slowly repaired relationships fractured by the birthday party disaster, with Aunt Carmen eventually apologizing for her cruel method of revelation, even while insisting that Maria had deserved to know the truth. Family gatherings remained somewhat awkward for months, with everyone hyper, aware of the secret that had been exposed and uncertain how to navigate conversations that had previously relied on maintaining the pretense of Maria's paternity. Some relatives were more supportive than others, with certain aunts and uncles showing genuine remorse for their participation in the deception, while others remained defensive about their choices. Maria's grandmother made a particular effort to rebuild their relationship, explaining that she had argued repeatedly over the years for telling Maria the truth, but had been overruled by Teresa and Robert, who believed the deception was kinder than the truth. These conversations helped Maria understand that the situation had been more complex than simply everyone agreeing to lie to her, that there had been disagreements and debates about the right course of action. She learned to differentiate between the people who had actively maintained the lie and those who had simply not contradicted it, between those who felt genuine remorse and those who remained convinced they had done the right thing. Through therapy that Teresa arranged and paid for, Maria worked on processing the layers of betrayal and rejection she felt, learning to separate her sense of self-worth from the circumstances of her conception and the choices made by adults before she existed. Her therapist helped her understand that David's abandonment and Robert's emotional distance were reflections of their limitations rather than her value as a person, that she had agency in deciding how much power to give these old wounds going forward. Maria also worked through her anger at Teresa, coming to a more nuanced understanding of the impossible situation her mother had faced as a young pregnant woman without support, making decisions that seemed necessary for survival even if they caused pain later. The process wasn't linear, with setbacks and renewed anger surfacing periodically, but gradually Maria found ways to integrate this new understanding of her origins into her broader sense of identity. She researched her Puerto Rican heritage more deeply, claimed cultural connections that belonged to her through Teresa regardless of David's absence, and began to build a sense of self that didn't require biological father validation. As graduation approached, Maria made decisions about her future that reflected both her academic ambitions and her desire for some distance from the family drama that had dominated her senior year. She applied to colleges in other states, seeking opportunities for geographical and emotional space to continue developing her identity apart from the circumstances of her birth. When acceptance letters arrived, Maria chose a university in California that offered a strong pre-law program and a substantial scholarship package that made attendance financially feasible despite her family's limited resources. The decision to move across the country was bittersweet, motivated partly by genuine academic opportunity and partly by a need to escape the constant reminders of her complicated family situation. Teresa supported Maria's choice while clearly struggling with the impending separation, understanding that her daughter needed distance, but sad to lose the daily presence of the child she had raised despite all the complications. Robert's response to Maria's college plans was more muted, a mixture of relief and regret that seemed to acknowledge how his limitations as a parental figure had contributed to her desire to leave. Carlos and Sofia were upset about Maria moving so far away, having relied on their older sister for stability throughout the family turbulence, and Maria promised them frequent video calls and visits during breaks, even as she knew the physical distance would fundamentally change their relationships. The months between acceptance and actual departure were emotionally complex, filled with preparations and goodbyes and attempts to reconcile the family they had been with the family they were becoming. Maria found herself appreciating aspects of her childhood she had previously taken for granted, recognizing that despite the deception and dysfunction, there had been genuine love and care in her family, even if it hadn't been perfect or uncomplicated. She compiled photographs and mementos that represented the good memories alongside the difficult revelations, trying to honor the complexity of her experience rather than reducing it to simple narratives of betrayal or redemption. Maria also reached out one final time to David, sending a message that she didn't expect him to respond to, but needed to write for her own closure, explaining how his abandonment and subsequent rejection had affected her, but that she was choosing to move forward with her life regardless of his choices, that she was releasing any expectations about their relationship, while reserving the right to potentially reach out again in the future if her feelings changed. The actual departure for college was emotionally overwhelming for everyone involved, with Teresa crying openly as she helped Maria pack her belongings into boxes that would be shipped across country. The physical act of dismantling Maria's childhood bedroom felt symbolic of the broader dismantling and reconstruction of family relationships that had occurred over the past year. Robert offered to drive Maria to the airport, an offer she accepted despite the awkwardness between them, recognizing it as an attempt at connection that deserved acknowledgement even if their relationship would never be what either had once pretended it was. The drive to the airport was mostly silent, punctuated by occasional comments about logistics and reminders about staying safe, both of them struggling with emotions neither was fully equipped to express. At the departure gate, Robert surprised Maria by hugging her tightly and telling her he was proud of her resilience and strength, that she had handled an impossible situation with more grace than most adults could manage. The words meant more to Maria than she expected, not because they erased the past, but because they represented honest acknowledgement from someone who had struggled to be honest throughout her childhood. She realized that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or excusing what had happened, but could coexist with ongoing hurt and disappointment while still allowing for moments of genuine connection. On the plane, Maria reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the months since that birthday party explosion, how naive she had been about her own origins, and how much more complicated her sense of identity had become. She thought about David occasionally, but found her feelings about him becoming more abstract over time. Less about the specific man who had rejected her and more about what his absence represented about choice and responsibility, and the ways people fail each other. She thought about Teresa's choices with more compassion than she had initially been able to access, understanding intellectually, if not emotionally, the desperation and fear that had motivated years of deception. She thought about Robert and the ways people could simultaneously try their best and fall short, could mean well while causing harm, could love imperfectly but still genuinely. She thought about Carlos and Sofia and her ongoing responsibility as their older sister, regardless of the biology that complicated their relationships, her determination to maintain bonds with them even across distance. Maria's first semester of college was a period of intense growth and self-discovery as she navigated academic challenges and social opportunities while processing the family revelations that continued to affect her emotionally. She joined campus organizations focused on Latino student support, finding community among people who shared cultural heritage, even as she grappled privately with questions about her biological heritage, and what percentage of her identity came from the absent David versus the present Teresa. She excelled in her classes, channeling complicated emotions into academic achievement, finding that her experience with family secrets and legal questions made her even more interested in pursuing law as a career. She made friends who knew nothing about her complicated family history, allowing her to experiment with different ways of telling her story or not telling it at all, discovering that she had agency over how much of her past to carry into new relationships. Sometimes she mentioned being raised by a stepfather. Sometimes she referred vaguely to family complications, and occasionally with close friends she shared the full story of discovery and betrayal and multiple rejections. Maria video called Carlos and Sofia weekly as promised, maintaining her role in their lives even from across the country, offering advice on middle school drama and homework problems and sibling conflicts that seemed trivial compared to what they'd all been through but mattered immensely in their daily lives. Her calls with Teresa were less frequent and more strained, both of them still navigating how to rebuild trust while acknowledging the ways trust had been violated. Maria came to understand that healing wouldn't be linear or complete, that certain hurts would remain even as she moved forward with her life, that family relationships existed in permanent states of complexity that couldn't be resolved through single conversations or simple forgiveness. During Thanksgiving break, Maria returned home for the first time since leaving for college, finding the family dynamics had continued evolving in her absence, with Teresa and Robert attending couples therapy and working on their marriage issues that extended beyond just the paternity deception. The holiday was both comforting in its familiarity and strange in how much had changed, with everyone trying to perform normalcy while acknowledging the fundamental shifts in their relationships and understanding. Maria recognized that she would spend years processing what had happened, integrating this knowledge into her broader sense of self, but that she was stronger and more resilient than she had known before being tested by discovery and rejection. She had learned that identity wasn't just about biology or legal relationships, but about choices and commitments and the ways people showed up for each other through difficulty. She understood that she might never fully resolve her feelings about David's abandonment or Robert's limitations or Teresa's deception, but that she could still build a meaningful life despite carrying these unresolved hurts. As she looked toward her future college completion, law school, career, her own eventual family, Maria carried both the wounds and wisdom of her experience, determined that if she ever had children, they would always know the truth about their origins regardless of how complicated that truth might be, believing that honesty and acceptance were ultimately kinder than comfortable lies that eventually shattered under the weight of sustained deception.